David Bowie was lost in his Ziggy Stardust persona when Jimmy Cliff's Rastafarian teachings showed him his true identity and changed glam rock forever. It was March 18, 1973, in a dimly lit recording studio in London's Trident Studios. David Bowie, dressed in his full Ziggy Stardust regalia, orange hair, glittering makeup, and skin-tight metallic jumpsuit, sat alone on a stool, staring at his reflection in the control room glass. But the man looking back wasn't David Robert Jones from Brixton. It wasn't even David Bowie anymore. It was Ziggy Stardust, and David was terrified because he could no longer tell where the character ended and he began. The Ziggy Stardust persona had consumed David's life completely. What had started as a creative exploration of androgyny, sexuality, and rock stardom had become a prison of artificial identity that was slowly destroying his sense of self. He was living as Ziggy 24 hours a day, speaking as Ziggy, thinking as Ziggy, and losing David Bowie, let alone David Jones, in the process. "I don't know who I am anymore," David confided to his producer Tony Visconti, just hours before the session that would change his life. "Ziggy has taken over everything. I look in the mirror and I see this alien creature, but I can't find the human being underneath all the makeup and costumes. I'm disappearing into my own creation." The pressure of maintaining the Ziggy persona was destroying David both psychologically and spiritually. He was consuming dangerous amounts of cocaine, barely sleeping, and living in a constant state of paranoia and anxiety. His marriage was failing, his relationships with friends were strained, and he felt completely disconnected from any authentic sense of purpose or identity. What made the situation even more desperate was that David felt trapped by his own success. Ziggy Stardust had made him an international superstar, but the character had become so popular and lucrative that everyone around him, managers, record executives, fans, wanted him to remain Ziggy forever. The thought of abandoning the persona felt like career suicide, but continuing to live as Ziggy felt like actual suicide. That afternoon, Jimmy Cliff arrived at Trident Studios for what was supposed to be a brief collaboration session. Jimmy had been invited by Tony Visconti to add some reggae guitar to one of David's new tracks, part of an experiment in incorporating Caribbean rhythms into glam rock. But when Jimmy walked into the studio and saw David in his full Ziggy regalia, he immediately recognized something that everyone else had missed. This wasn't an artist playing a character. This was a human soul trapped inside an artificial identity. Jimmy had encountered this kind of spiritual crisis before, both in his own life and in his work with other musicians. He understood how easy it was for performers to lose themselves in the personas they created, especially when those personas brought fame and money but disconnected them from their authentic spiritual essence. "Brethren," Jimmy said gently, approaching David with the calm confidence that came from years of Rastafarian spiritual practice, "you look like a man who's forgotten his own name." David was startled by Jimmy's directness. Most people who met him during this period either fawned over Ziggy Stardust or treated him as if the character were his real identity. But Jimmy was looking past the makeup and costume, speaking directly to the confused and frightened human being underneath. "I'm Ziggy Stardust," David replied automatically, the response he'd been giving for months. Jimmy smiled, knowingly. "No, brethren. Ziggy Stardust is what you're wearing. But who are you when you take off the costume? Who are you when you wash off the makeup? Who are you when it's just you and Jah in the quiet moments before dawn?" The question hit David like a physical blow. He hadn't been alone with himself, really alone, without the Ziggy persona, in over a year. He had been so busy being an alien rock star that he had forgotten how to be a human being. "I don't know anymore," David admitted, his voice breaking with vulnerability that no one had heard from him since the Ziggy character took over. "I created this character to explore ideas about stardom and sexuality and alienation, but now the character has created me. I don't know how to exist without him." Jimmy recognized the spiritual crisis immediately. In Rastafarian tradition, this kind of identity confusion was understood as a separation from one's divine essence, a disconnection from the I Am consciousness that represents each person's authentic spiritual nature. The solution wasn't psychological therapy or career counseling, it was spiritual realignment. "Come with me, brethren," Jimmy said, gently taking David's arm. "Let's go somewhere Ziggy can't follow." Jimmy led David out of the recording studio and into the London streets. But instead of heading to a pub or restaurant like most musicians would, he took David to a small Rastafarian reasoning house in Notting Hill that served as a gathering place for Caribbean immigrants and spiritual seekers. David, still in his full Ziggy costume, felt ridiculous walking through the working-class neighborhood. The metallic jumpsuit and orange hair that made him feel powerful on stage made him feel exposed and foolish in the real world. But Jimmy's presence was calming, and for the first time in months, David began to relax. The reasoning house was unlike anything David had ever experienced. It was a simple room filled with natural materials, wood, plants, and instruments made from gourds and drums made from animal skins. The atmosphere was peaceful and grounded, completely different from the artificial electric environment of rock studios and concert venues. Several Rastafarian elders were gathered for evening reasoning, the traditional practice of spiritual discussion and meditation that formed the heart of Rastafarian community life. When Jimmy arrived with David, the elders welcomed them both without judgment or surprise, even though David was clearly dressed as some kind of glam rock space alien. Jah welcomes all seekers, explained Brother Marcus, an elderly Jamaican man who had been practicing Rastafarianism for over 30 years. It doesn't matter what costume you're wearing on the outside. What matters is whether your heart is ready to hear truth. Jimmy began the evening by sharing his understanding of David's spiritual crisis with the gathered elders. In the Rastafarian tradition, personal problems were often discussed communally, with the wisdom of the community helping individuals find their way back to spiritual alignment. This brethren is a talented artist who has created a powerful character, Jimmy explained. But the character has become so strong that it's consuming his authentic self. He's lost touch with his divine essence, with the I am that Jah placed within him. Brother Marcus nodded knowingly. This is the danger of all illusion, whether it's the illusion of materialism, the illusion of fame, or the illusion of any identity that separates us from our true spiritual nature. Babylon's system creates these false identities to keep us from recognizing our divine heritage. As the reasoning session continued, Jimmy began teaching David about Rastafarian concepts of identity and spirituality. He explained how Rastafarians understood each person as containing a divine spark, the I am consciousness, that connected them directly to Jah, God, and to all other living beings. Ziggy Stardust is not evil, Jimmy explained. Creativity is a gift from Jah. But when any created thing, whether it's a song, a character, or even a career, becomes more important than our connection to divine love, then it becomes a form of idolatry that separates us from our true self. David listened with growing fascination as Jimmy described Rastafarian beliefs about authenticity, spiritual identity, and the difference between ego-driven personas and spirit-guided creativity. For the first time in months, he felt like someone was speaking directly to his deepest concerns about identity, creativity, and spiritual purpose. In Rastafari, we say that each person must find their own route to Zion, Jimmy continued. Zion isn't a place, it's a state of consciousness where you know who you really are, and you live in harmony with Jah's love. But you can't reach Zion by pretending to be someone else, no matter how glamorous or successful that someone else might be. As the evening progressed, the Rastafarian elders began sharing their own stories of spiritual awakening, times when they had been lost in material concerns or false identities before finding their way back to authentic spiritual consciousness. Their stories helped David understand that his crisis wasn't unique. It was part of the universal human struggle to maintain authentic identity in a world that constantly encouraged people to adopt false personas. But the real breakthrough came when Jimmy invited David to participate in a Rastafarian chanting session. The chant was simple, just the repetition of Jah Rastafari, but it was designed to quiet the mind and connect participants with their deeper spiritual essence. At first, David felt self-conscious chanting in his Ziggy costume. But as the rhythm of the chant began to work on his consciousness, something remarkable happened. The anxiety and confusion that had been consuming him for months began to dissolve, replaced by a sense of peace and clarity he hadn't experienced since before Ziggy Stardust took over his life. Jah Rastafari, Jah Rastafari, Jah Rastafari. With each repetition of the sacred phrase, David felt more connected to his authentic self and less identified with the artificial persona that had been suffocating his spirit. The makeup and costume he was wearing began to feel like exactly what they were: theatrical props that had nothing to do with his real identity. During the chanting, David experienced what he later described as a vision or spiritual revelation. He saw himself not as Ziggy Stardust, the alien rock star, but as David Jones, a working-class kid from Brixton, who had been given extraordinary creative gifts that were meant to serve love and spiritual awakening, not just fame and commercial success. More importantly, he understood that he could continue using personas and characters in his music without losing himself in them. The key was maintaining conscious awareness of his authentic spiritual identity while using theatrical elements as tools for artistic expression, rather than as replacements for genuine self-knowledge. When the chanting session ended, David was weeping with relief. For the first time in over a year, he felt like himself again. Not Ziggy Stardust, not even David Bowie the rock star, but David Jones, the human being with a direct connection to divine love and creative purpose. "Thank you," David whispered to Jimmy and the assembled elders. "You've given me back my life." Jimmy smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had helped a fellow soul find its way back to spiritual truth. "Jah gave you your life, brethren. We just helped you remember where you put it." The impact of that evening on David's career was immediate and transformative. Within weeks, he announced that he would be retiring the Ziggy Stardust character permanently. The decision shocked the music industry and disappointed many fans, but David knew that continuing to live as Ziggy would ultimately destroy both his creativity and his sanity. More importantly, David's encounter with Rastafarian spirituality began influencing his music in ways that would define the rest of his career. His subsequent albums incorporated themes of spiritual searching, authentic identity, and the balance between theatrical expression and genuine self-knowledge. David also began incorporating reggae rhythms and Caribbean musical influences into his work, directly crediting Jimmy Cliff and the Rastafarian community for opening his consciousness to new forms of creative expression. Songs like Golden Years and later Let's Dance showed clear reggae influences that could be traced back to that night in the Notting Hill Reasoning House. The transformation also affected David's approach to performance and persona creation. While he continued to create characters and theatrical presentations throughout his career, he never again lost himself in a persona the way he had with Ziggy Stardust. Instead, he maintained conscious awareness of his authentic spiritual identity while using various characters as vehicles for exploring different aspects of human experience. Jimmy continued to serve as a spiritual mentor to David throughout the 1970s, helping him navigate the challenges of maintaining authenticity while working in an industry that often rewarded artificial personas over genuine artistic expression. Their friendship became a model for how artists from different cultural backgrounds could learn from each other's spiritual traditions. The influence extended beyond David's individual career to the broader world of glam rock and theatrical performance. David's decision to abandon Ziggy Stardust at the height of the character's popularity inspired other musicians to examine their own relationship to the personas they created, leading to a more conscious approach to theatrical performance that balanced entertainment value with spiritual authenticity. Years later, when David was asked about the most important influences on his artistic development, he consistently cited his encounter with Jimmy Cliff and Rastafarian spirituality as one of the pivotal moments in his creative evolution. "Jimmy saved my life," David said in a 1980 interview. "I was disappearing into a character I had created, losing my humanity to maintain an image that was making everyone else rich but was killing my soul. Jimmy showed me that I could be theatrical and authentic at the same time, that creativity could serve spiritual truth rather than replace it." Jimmy, characteristically humble, viewed his role in David's transformation as simply sharing the wisdom that Rastafarian elders had shared with him during his own spiritual journey. "Every artist must find their own way to serve Jah through their creativity," Jimmy reflected. "David is a brilliant creator, but he needed to remember that his gift comes from divine love, not from artificial personas." Once he reconnected with that truth, his creativity became even more powerful because it was serving spirit instead of just serving ego. The story of Jimmy Cliff's spiritual intervention and David Bowie's identity crisis became legendary in music circles, inspiring countless musicians to examine their own relationship to the characters and images they created. It demonstrated that artistic success didn't require sacrificing authentic spiritual identity, and that mentorship across cultural and religious boundaries could create profound positive change. More broadly, David's transformation from Ziggy Stardust to spiritually conscious artist helped change the trajectory of glam rock and theatrical performance, moving the genre toward a more conscious integration of entertainment and authentic self-expression. Today, David Bowie's decision to abandon Ziggy Stardust at the height of the character's popularity is recognized as one of the most courageous artistic choices in rock history. But the hidden story of how Jimmy Cliff's Rastafarian wisdom made that choice possible reveals the power of spiritual mentorship and cross-cultural learning to transform individual lives and entire artistic movements. The night that Jimmy Cliff helped David Bowie find himself beneath the Ziggy Stardust persona proved that no matter how lost someone might become in artificial identities, authentic spiritual connection can always guide them back to their true self. And sometimes, that guidance comes from the most unexpected sources. A Rastafarian reggae singer who saw past the glitter and makeup to recognize a human soul crying out for help. If this incredible story of spiritual mentorship and artistic transformation moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell for more amazing tales of how authentic spiritual guidance can rescue even the most lost souls and transform entire artistic movements. Share this video with someone who believes that our true identity is always more important than any persona we create, and that spiritual wisdom can come from the most unexpected teachers. Have you ever felt lost in a role or identity that was consuming your authentic self? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to check out our other videos about the moments when spiritual intervention saved careers and transformed lives.